Okay, so in these first two segments, we're going to situate those texts called the Upanishads in the historical setting of North India around 500 BC, when that long Vedic age was coming to a close. In this segment, we're going to look at the political economy of India at that time, and then in the next segment, we'll look at the social conditions. The idea is to get a better sense of why people might have made this kind of huge shift from ritualistic religion to inner spiritual seeking. Okay, so let's imagine our train of thought kind of stops at the year 500 BC and drops us off somewhere along the Ganga River in North India. This river also can be called the Ganges, right? What kind of things do you suppose we might see going on all around us at the Ganga River? Well, first of all, we would have seen a lot of paddy fields. The Gangetic Plains are an area where wild rice grows natively, and as Vedic communities settled there, coming from the Punjab in the west, they stopped being pastoral and took on a more intensively rice-oriented agriculture. Now, you may be aware that rice cultivation requires two things. One, you need a ton of water, and two, you need a ton of manpower. You can't have rice fields without being able to irrigate constantly, and you can't pick rice and transplant it so on without a lot of farmhands. It's backbreaking work, so you got to have more laborers on your farm than if you're just subsistence farming. This creates a hierarchical social situation where you have people who own large farms and fields and laborers to work it. Right? The other thing is that the bonus of cultivating rice, the reason why people would go to such trouble to farm it, is that it gives massive surpluses. You can easily make a lot more rice than you can eat, which means that a good landowner can store it, sell it, feed an army with it. And that's the kind of economic growth that you can see in the archaeological record in the late Vedic period in that valley of the Ganga River. This would have had a dramatic impact on what you can think of as the political economy of the time. At the start of the late Vedic age, back at 1000 BC, we find the emergence of the first clan-based territories, Janapadas, that started to maintain ancestral agricultural domains in the Punjab and the upper Ganga Valley. Before that time, in the early Vedic period, remember, they were basically semi-nomadic pastoralists, roaming as their cows roamed. Right? Once they settled into established rice-based estates, these Vedic states grew militarized and powerful. Some of them started to swallow up their neighbors, becoming what got to be called Mahajanapadas in Sanskrit, mega territories. There were 16 of these Mahajanapadas, mostly huddled around the Ganga. You can see them on this map. These were the first monarchical states in ancient India, which would have had imperial rulers. And maybe they would have done those horse sacrifices that we talked about. And even if they didn't do those, they would have had more complex state-level governments filled with ministers, generals, magistrates, other leaders who would have assembled together at a king's court at a capital, right? The Ganga made for an excellent highway also, and Vedic culture started changing because of this mobility. It transformed from a village-based, hermetically sealed economy into one that was mobile. It was bustling with merchants and traders, artisans. There was plenty of money to be made. In fact, speaking of money, this is when we find the earliest currency in India from around 700 to 600 BC. The minting of coins was no doubt indicative of the greater power of these late Vedic monarchies, right? These states could now generate wealth just by collecting taxes and tariffs from rice farms and traders. The increase in agricultural output, trade, militarized power, it also led to the growth of urban centers, cities, which tended to be located at boundaries between different trade zones. This is a perfect place also for kings to put down their capitals so they could easily collect taxes and tariffs. Another phenomenon that went hand in hand with increases in military and mercantile power was an increase in social stratification in Vedic society. Early Vedic society was also hierarchical. It's not that it wasn't, but it was probably more of a flexible hierarchy where one's position in a small tribal group or clan wasn't dependent wholly on birth, but it was dependent on ability or talent. So if you showed that you had a talent for having sacred power or Brahman, for example, you could act as a Brahmin. If you were strong, you could be a warrior, a Kshatriya. But by now, by 500 BC, your occupation became a hereditary thing. You could be a Brahmin only if you were born to a Brahmin family, and you were a warrior only if you were born to a warrior family, and so on. This hereditary social status went hand in hand with more rigid systems of land ownership and inheritance, so that the haves started looking and living a lot differently from the have-nots in post-Vedic India. The English word that we use for this kind of fixed social stratification based on birth is caste. And in our next segment, we'll be looking more closely at how the system kind of grew up along with a second system of social difference called life stages right around the same time. To close out this segment, though, let me look at how religion and culture also changed in the post-Vedic age. For one, there were a few new issues that started surfacing because of this urbanized world and the new political economy that was based on these Mahajanapada monarchies, also because of all this trade that was happening. And also the increased social hierarchy. They all generated a new set of questions. One problem for a religion was that of gender. For women, traditional Vedic ritual life, as we've seen, was really limited in scope. They were basically just objectified symbols of their husband's domesticity or receptacles of any fertility quotient that the rituals might yield, right? But by about 500 BC, it feels like there was a greater need to have spaces in Hindu religious life where women could have their own active subject position. Women needed to have pathways to actively do religious things for themselves and for others. Other new or reframed issues at this time were violence and death. Remember how Brahmins were uncomfortable with killing at the sacrifice, with the strangulating the victim and so on? In the post-Vedic age, monarchies were, of course, more militarized. There were bigger and more bloodier wars. And we can guess that with bigger cities, there would have been an increase in disease and death and crime, poverty, famine, overall suffering kind of increases. With these new questions of suffering come a new set of religious ideas and concerns that begin to grip religious and philosophical thinkers around 500 BC in India. There was a wide acceptance of the idea that once we die, our soul actually doesn't die, and in fact transmigrates to get a new body. This is the idea of rebirth, samsara in Sanskrit, and it's an idea about the afterlife that gets shared across all of the major religions that grow up in India at this time: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. Even today, it's what people believe in all three of these faiths. And also in all three, the root cause of this samsara, this rebirth, the reason for our rebirth, is a phenomenon called karma, or intentional action. All three of the major religious traditions that grow up out of India, Upanishadic Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, investigated the problem of karma and rebirth. And basically they came up with different versions of the same answer that this answer we can call renunciation. And renunciation is when one is asked to disengage with the everyday concerns of worldly life, of your work, of rituals, your obligations and duties, and instead you have to pursue a spiritual path that takes one inward rather than outward. We'll take a closer look at how these ideas come about in our third segment. But before we get there, I wanted to tackle one really complicated and important aspect of how everyday life changed in the post-Vedic period that we should probably get our heads around. And I'm talking about how Brahmins began to conceptualize the structure of normative Hindu society. These are the categories of varna, social class, and ashrama, or the life stages. This is what we'll look at in our next segment, so See you.